Busting Indie Myths, part 28. And in this Busting Indie Myths, we're going to address the oft-heard claim that somehow Margaret Thatcher believed that all it would take for the SNP to make an independent Scotland would be if they got a majority of MPs in the House of Commons. Now, we are going to spend the next few minutes explaining that Margaret Thatcher never said such a thing, and even if she had said such a thing, she would have been wrong. Okay? So, Margaret Thatcher did not claim that a majority of SNP MPs would be sufficient for independence. But who's starting this? Who's been saying this? Well, at the SNP conference back a couple of Sundays ago, I think now, Keith Brown was quoted at least twice in saying it, and we've got the videos here, and we'll play the videos so that you can see what we're talking about. So let's play the first video here.
But the point is, Margaret Thatcher was explicit in recognising the fact that if we win, the SNP win a majority of seats at a Westminster election, that is a mandate for independence.
But the point is, this is him, Margaret Thatcher was explicit in recognising the fact that if we win, the SNP win a majority of seats at a Westminster election, that is a mandate for independence. Okay, now a majority of seats, if you're talking about an overall majority of the 59 seats, that would be 29 seats. So did Margaret Thatcher ever imply such a thing? Well, Keith's not going to stop, and he's telling us again the very next day, on Tuesday, October 2023, in an interview with BBC Politics Live, he expanded upon his considered opinion. Let's watch that video.
If we win the election in Scotland, i.e. we win the most seats at that election, then we will have a mandate to start independence negotiations. Now, it's not a new idea. Margaret Thatcher agreed this way back in the 1980s, that the party, the SNP, if they win the largest majority of seats in Scotland, they have the right to fulfil that mandate for independence.
So, he slightly changes it there. He says, if we win the election, i.e. we win the most seats at that election, then we will have a mandate to start independence negotiations. Okay, so the day before it was he'd have a mandate for independence, as in, that's it guys, let's pack up and we're leaving. But the next day it's, oh, that's just a mandate to begin negotiations for independence. And then he says, now, it's not a new idea. Margaret Thatcher agreed this. Oh, she agreed it, did she? With whom? Way back in the 1980s, that the party, the SNP, if they win the largest majority of seats in Scotland, they have the right to fulfil that mandate for independence. Well, obviously, that's interesting. So what we have to do then is to find out, well, did she ever say that? And nobody has been able to find her ever saying that in Parliament. And you can check by going onto the Hansard website and searching for Margaret Thatcher's comments on separation. And to be frank with you, she didn't really say very much, because back then, when she was in power, Scottish independence was not an issue. It was not an issue at the polls. Okay, there was always people voting for the SNP, but they were always just getting a handful of candidates, MPs elected, and it wasn't really a big issue, so it wasn't something that she had to really think about. However, she did at that time get involved with that whole idea of having a Scottish Assembly. And that did muddy the waters a bit. But even then, nobody can find any information of her saying such a thing. The closest that we've ever found is a paragraph which appears in her biography, Margaret Thatcher, The Downing Street Years, here on page 624. And I'll just read out the bit. We'll put up the picture of this page 624, page 624, and you can read it with me, as it were. Let's get rid of that banner so we can see it properly. There we go. The bit that I have penciled there. In fact, I'll read it from just above that. The Tory party is not, of course, an English party, but a Unionist one, says Margaret Thatcher. If it sometimes seems English to some, that is because the Union is inevitably dominated by England by reason of its greater population. The Scots, being a historic nation with a proud past, will inevitably resent some expressions of this fact from time to time. And this is the sentence. This is the one. As a nation, they have an undoubted right to national self-determination. Thus far, they have exercised that right by joining and remaining in the Union. That's the sentence, and that sentence doesn't say anything that we don't already know, or which in itself is particularly controversial. She's just pointing out that Scots exercise their right to national self-determination by staying in the Union. She then goes on, perhaps a little bit more controversially, should they determine on independence, no English party or politician would stand in their way. Well, I think if you're an English politician and you want the UK to stay together, then you do have a right to be heard and to argue that Scotland should stay. Quite frankly, I don't think that point had occurred to Mrs. Thatcher when she wrote that particular sentence. However, that's really all that needs to be said there. Okay. So that's the point that she was making. And, you know, even if she had said, which she clearly hasn't said, but even if she had said that a majority of seats at the Westminster Parliament would be sufficient for the SNP to begin independence negotiations, even if she had said that, she would have been wrong. You know, she would have been constitutionally in error. So it's funny that the SNP should suddenly love Thatcher now that they've found a fake quote that they can misrepresent. Oh, Mrs. Thatcher said it, so it must be true. What? I thought you didn't like Mrs. Thatcher. Oh, we don't like her, but we like her now that she said that. Some of these folk are all over the place. So we can basically say that it's a complete myth that Mrs. Thatcher ever said such a thing. Mrs. Thatcher never said that a majority of SNP MPs would be enough for independence. Okay, here ends Busting Indy Myths, part 28